And so when I went to Portugal, that was one of the questions I had. Well, let's assume that decriminalization has actually kept drug usage rates fairly steady, as the Portuguese officials and experts with whom I spoke before I went there told me. And let's assume that they're actually managing those problems better than Western European countries with a criminalized scheme, as they also claimed. I'll assume that that's true, and when I get there, they're going to have charts that are going to confirm those claims. So then my question became, well, why? Why is it that drug decriminalization works? And what I found in speaking to them was a consensus about what those reasons are. And I think the reasons are intuitively compelling, just to someone using basic common sense. The first issue that these drug policymakers identified as to their principal impediment pre-decriminalization in the 1990s with trying to get the drug addiction problem under control was that when you tell the population that you're going to turn them into criminals and arrest and prosecute and imprison them if they're using drugs, the last thing they're ever going to want to do is to go to the government and seek out help by identifying themselves as drug users. They become afraid of the government. A huge wall, a huge barrier is placed between the government and the citizenry as a result of criminalization for reasons that make perfect sense. And so if you're a policymaker and you want to reach drug users to educate them about the need for harm reduction and clean needles and the availability of methadone or treatment clinics, or if you want to encourage them to think about how to use drugs in a less harmful way or to seek out the help they need, the last thing they're going to do is listen to you, because to them, you are their criminalizers. You are the people who may put them into prison. And it was a huge problem for Portuguese officials who wanted to reach the population to have this wall erected between a population that feared them and therefore was unwilling to listen to them. And I think if you go to the communities in the United States that are most affected by our criminalization laws, that fear on the part of the citizenry of the government is every bit as pervasive. And the ability of the government to reach those citizens is therefore diminished, if not rendered non-existent. And what decriminalization has done is it has removed the fear on the part of the citizenry of the government, so that the government can now go to the citizenry and say, we have these treatment options that have been made available to you that you ought to seek out. And we want you to listen to us when we have these educational programs that talk about the dangers of drugs and drug addictions and the way in which they can be abused and the harms that come from them. And the ability of the government to communicate with its populace and to offer treatment and to access those communities has been substantially enhanced as a result of decriminalization, because that barrier has been removed. And what that has done is it has enabled all sorts of addicts and people with drug problems and people using dirty needles or other forms of reckless drug behavior to seek out government programs that enable them to reduce their drug usage or reduce the harms that come from it, or to get off drugs entirely. And that is one compelling way that decriminalization actually decreases drug usage, which is it enables the government to be more effective in bringing treatment options to the population. Second way I think is even more important and even easier to understand, which is, as we all know, if you deploy a huge police force to search for and arrest and imprison and prosecute nonviolent drug offenders and imprison people by the hundreds of thousands in prisons, you are burning money in the prison state. You are simply throwing money towards a program, a policy that is designed to do nothing but take drug users and drug addicts and put them into cages. Once you decriminalize and you no longer arrest and prosecute and imprison drug users, enormous amounts of money are then freed up. And if it's a poor country like Portugal, or a country with significant budgetary and financial constraints like the United States, freeing up enormous amounts of money can create extraordinarily valuable opportunities on the part of the government to address drug problems. You can create all kinds of potent educational campaigns. You can build treatment facilities and pay drug counselors and pay psychologists so that people who never had access to treatment before now have ample and well-funded treatment programs. You save lots of money, but you also provide much better services to the drug-using population so that people who want treatment can then afford it. Portugal had virtually no ability to provide meaningful treatment in the 1990s as their problems with drugs skyrocketed, because they were wasting it all on trying to imprison people. It was decriminalization that freed up that money that has, and you can look at the resources devoted in Portugal to treatment since 2001, that has really skyrocketed. And so now, instead of being put into prison, drug addicts are going to treatment centers, and they're learning how to control their drug usage or to get off drugs entirely. And so I think when you look at those two aspects, it's not surprising that drug usage rates have not skyrocketed the way they have in Western Europe and in the United States, but have clearly begun to subside and in some cases significantly decrease. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the law and how it actually works in practice. And I go into that in some detail in the report, so I'll just kind of paint with broad strokes what actually the structure is. As Tim said in his introduction, there's a significant difference between legalization, which means that there are no longer any prohibitions whatsoever on drug usage, and decriminalization, which means that under the law, it is still prohibited to use drugs, but that it is no longer brought into the criminal realm. It is no longer in any way a criminal offense. You are not charged with a crime. You are not threatened with prison. You don't have a criminal record. There's no conviction. There's no judge. There's no court. It is removed entirely from the criminalization scheme. And although some countries now have de facto decriminalization for some kinds of drugs, mostly marijuana, whereby they've decided that imprisoning people for possession of marijuana is no longer a wise thing to do, even though the state retains the authority to do so. Portugal is the only state explicitly in Western Europe and in the Western world to explicitly decriminalize drugs. And they've decriminalized all drugs, from heroin and methamphetamines and cocaine down to marijuana. And the decriminalization applies only to personal usage, which is defined by the law to mean possessing a quantity of drugs sufficient for the average user to have 10 days worth of a supply. Once you have an excess of 10 days worth of supply, you're no longer a mere user, you're now a trafficker. And drug trafficking remains criminal in Portugal for reasons mostly having to do with the fact that their neighbors and the United States would not tolerate a country legalizing drug trafficking because of the perception that that would adversely harm other countries as well. So the decriminalization approach applies only to drug users. So if you go to somebody's apartment who wants to sell you drugs, who has a stash of a month's worth of marijuana, they are committing a crime. But by buying a certain quantity under 10 days of personal usage, you are not committing a crime in any way. Providing drugs to minors continues to be a crime. And as I said, all forms of drug usage, including small amounts of marijuana, remain prohibited by law, just not any longer as a criminal offense, only as an administrative one. What happens is if a police officer knows or sees that you have drugs or are using drugs, they are required, there's no discretion, they're still required to issue a citation to you for violating the law. And what happens is but they don't arrest you. And what happens is that citation is then sent to what's called a dissuasion commission that is set up by the decriminalization law. And the dissuasion commission consists of 3 members, one appointed by what is the equivalent of the justice ministry, which is usually someone with a legal background, a lawyer, and 2 are appointed by what is the equivalent of the health ministry. And those are typically physicians or counselors or psychologists, health professionals. And this dissuasion commission is a 3-person commission that ultimately decides the disposition of the citation. And if the citation is sent, you have 72 hours to appear. They will give you a time and a date within 72 hours, and it actually works. 72 hours is typically when you appear. And what's most interesting about these dissuasion commissions is that they are purposely designed to avoid all of the trappings of any kind of a court. They're designed to be informal and to avoid any notion of guilt. So the person who's cited has the prerogative to demand that no notices be sent to their home to preserve their privacy. The 3 members of the commission purposely avoid anything like robes or any kind of formal clothing that suggests that they're an authority sitting in judgment. They sit on the same level rather than on an elevated platform. The entire proceeding is designed to convey informality and non-judgment, to offer the person who cited the opportunity for treatment rather than some sort of mandatory punishment or judgment. And in over 85% of the cases, those proceedings end with absolutely nothing happening, with what is called a suspended proceeding, conditioned on the person going to treatment, and that whether the person fulfills that treatment is actually optional. There's no enforcement mechanism to make them go to treatment. There's no penalty for their failure to do so. And it's designed, the reason why there is this proceeding at all, is it's designed to bring citizens and the government together so that when the citizens want treatment, the government is there to enable and facilitate and to provide it. And there's lots of details about how the various sanctions work that are available to the commission, which are very rarely imposed, that I include in my report and I won't detail here. But I think what's most important about understanding how these commissions work is that they purposely avoid all guilt and are designed to encourage, upon an assessment by health professionals, not criminal professionals, whether or not treatment options ought to be offered and what type of treatment is appropriate. Just one word about police enforcement, because that's something that people typically wonder about is how do the police under decriminalization in Portugal continue to view the utility of issuing citations. And it's very difficult. You can talk to police officers, as I did. You can speak with law enforcement officials, as I did. But it's very difficult to acquire any sort of understanding statistically or anything beyond anecdotally about how police officers view decriminalization. But what seems pretty clear anecdotally is that at first there was kind of a generational split among police officers. Older police officers tended to view this dissuasion commission as kind of a joke. You know, they would issue a citation to a user, and 24 hours later they would see that user back on the street, sometimes using, and they would think, why am I going to waste my time and effort and energy giving a citation to somebody who has no prospect of going to prison? But what even older officers eventually understood, and almost the overwhelming majority of younger officers seem to now believe, and after 7 years this percentage has increased, is that it was criminalization that was futile, because they would issue citations and people would be out on the street 24 or 48 hours later, but without treatment. They would just have sat in a cage for 48 hours and still be addicts. Whereas now, you actually take these people and force them to go to a process where treatment is offered to them, and these officers believe that there's much greater utility in issuing citations now when there's something constructive being done in response to those citations rather than something punitive and counterproductive. And I think the chart in the report that I included demonstrates that it's been a fairly steady number of citations issued, even steadily increasing, which I think suggests that there's confidence in law enforcement officers with regard to how they perceive decriminalization. Now, what has happened in Portugal since decriminalization? Most of the answer to that is statistical, and I'll refer to a couple of the charts. But I want to sort of speak in broader terms about what has happened in Portugal since decriminalization. And I tried to categorize or to divide the analysis into two areas. First, what has happened in Portugal in absolute terms? Have prevalence rates increased? What about disease, drug-related diseases, and other pathologies? And secondly, how do those trends, whether good or bad, compare to other EU states and to the United States, Australia, and Canada? Because obviously, if there's some moderate increase in usage after decriminalization, but massive increases in Western Europe, the fact that there's some moderate increases in usage doesn't indict the policy. You would need to do a comparative assessment to determine whether or not, on balance, decriminalization has been effective. And I think that one of the things that drug policymakers look at more than anything else are trends in prevalence rates among adolescents and post-adolescents, meaning the 15 to 24 age group, and especially the 15 to 19 age group, because behavior that's there with regard to drugs is most predictive about ultimately what the population will do, about how attitudes are formed with regard to drug usage. And there are a couple of charts that I just want to point to that if you talk to Portuguese policymakers over and over, they will point to these as being the most significant confirmations of the wisdom of their policy. And on their face, they're just actually quite compelling. The first one is, and if you have the book, these are a little small, so you may not be able to see the details well, so you might want to look in the actual report. This one is from page 13. It's figure 5. And what this shows are prevalence rates, which means the percentage of the studied population which over its lifetime tries a particular drug. So